In 1986, London police had a strange case on their hands. Several elderly people were found dead in their homes over a 4-month period, as several of them were sodomized and sexually abused, along with their belongings missing. The police were on high alert as a psychopath was breaking into elderly people's homes, killing them, then robbing the place afterwards. Welcome to History's Biggest Villains. Kenneth Erskine was born in Hammersmith, London on July 1st, 1963, to a British mother and an Antiguan father. He was abandoned by his parents during childhood and attended various schools for children with special needs. Due to this neglect early on, he became increasingly violent, even attempting to drown one of his students on a field trip. He then dropped out of school, becoming homeless. Ken then began a life of crime, committing several burglaries. He was able to open 10 separate bank accounts with his criminal proceeds before being arrested. Since Ken was already experienced in breaking into homes, in 1986, he decided to up the ante. On April 9th, 1986, in Wandsworth, 78-year-old Eileen Ems was found murdered in her home. When she was discovered by her homemaid, it was thought that she had died of natural causes and there was no signs of violence or anything to suggest suspicious circumstances. She was in bed with her bedclothes pulled up to her chin. When the doctors first examined her, he thought that she had been dead for about 3 days. With no initial suspicion of foul play, he signed a death certificate, listing it as natural causes. It was only when the home aide noticed that the portable television was missing that she began to suspect things were not what they seemed. The police were called and the scene was re-examined. It was found that she had been strangled and that she had some bruising on her chest as if the killer had knelt on her while he did it. A post-mortem was carried out which revealed Ems had severe bruising to her upper and lower body, cracked ribs, and finger marks around her throat. She had died from strangulation and it was believed that she had been sexually assaulted because there were traces of semen found on her body. Investigators surmised that the killer had found an easy access point into the flat through an open window, as Nancy was known to often sleep with the window left slightly ajar when it was humid. Because of the many heat waves the UK experienced that spring and summer, police said this might have been an opportunistic crime which escalated into murder. The only clue the police were able to find was a single Afro-Caribbean hair on the sheet. On June 9th, 67-year-old Janet Crockett, who was the chairwoman of her local tenants association, was found strangled in her home. The killer had again staged the scene, pulling her bedclothes up to her chin. Her nightdress was torn off and neatly folded by the killer. In an unusual move, the killer had repositioned several family portraits on the mantelpiece in the bedroom, placing them either face down or turned towards the wall. The police were able to locate a single thumbprint on a plant pot from the mantelpiece and a clear palm print on a bedroom window, presumably left by the killer. Despite 2 elderly victims killed in almost identical fashion roughly 5 miles apart, the cases were not immediately linked, mainly because they were being investigated by different police stations. And although detectives working both cases did exchange information, they didn't believe that there was sufficient evidence to suspect the same attacker. 2 weeks later, an old man survived an encounter with an unknown assailant. 73-year-old Frederick Prentice was a retired pensioner who lived in an old people's home known as Bradmead, which was on Cedars Road in Clapham. At around 3 a.m. on June 27th, he was suddenly awoken from his sleep by what sounded like footsteps in the passageway outside his room. When he sat up, he saw the shadow outline of someone standing behind the glass of his unlocked door, which was soon opened when a stranger entered his room. He said the man was dressed in all dark clothing, and as he fumbled to turn on the light, the intruder placed his finger against his lips to keep him quiet. After he did this, the young man jumped onto Mr. Prentice before he was able to alert someone. He gripped the old man's throat and began to squeeze hard before relaxing it. He did this 4 times, squeezing his windpipe in a powerful grip, then allowing him to breathe. Prentice recalled how the man had a deranged grin on his face and was clearly enjoying the ordeal. The man then began hissing the same word over and over. Kill. 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 With the stranger's hand still gripped around his throat, Prentice was unable to shout for help. Mustering all his remaining strength, he managed to press the panic button on the wall above his bed. As he did this, the man violently pushed Mr. Prentice against the wall, jumped off the bed, and started running out of the room. Moments later, a warden entered, responding to the panic alarm, but the intruder had fled. He was described as being young, in his late teens to mid-20s, with dark hair and a suntan complexion. Police suspected that the intruder had been an experienced burglar who felt comfortable entering residential properties where the possibility of capture was high. Fred Prentice was lucky to be alive, and police were now suspecting that his attempted murder might be connected to the same individual who had killed Nancy Ems and Janet Crockett. Unbelievably, on the next morning, the killer would strike twice in the same night. This time, the madman chose the Somerville Hastings house in Stockwell Park Crescent. The night duty staff became suspicious at around 4 a.m. when they heard what sounded like someone using an electric razor. As they investigated, they saw a shadow of an intruder creeping through the corridors. They quickly contacted the police, but the man had vanished by the time officers arrived. It was then that the bodies of 84-year-old Valentine Gleam and 94-year-old Zbigniew Stabrava were found in their adjoining rooms at the home. Polish-born Stabrava, who fled his native country to escape the Nazis, had been strangled in the same manner as former British Army officer Gleam, who had also been sexually assaulted. The police presence did increase, and the killer had become aware of this because he would strike again just over a week later. However, this time, he chose an area outside of Stockwell. By now, the media were referring to him as the Stockwell Strangler. At some point between the 6th and 9th of July, the killer crossed the River Thames and entered the Greater London home of 82-year-old widower William Carman, who lived alone. Mr. Carman's daughter found his body in the early morning hours of July 9th, in what would have been the killer's modus operandi of leaving his victim in their bed, making it appear that they had died in their sleep. But once again, the telltale signs were evident, that the killer had turned all the photos in the flat to face the wall, whilst footprints located outside matched those found at other crime scenes. Presumably, at some point during the last 3 days, the killer had entered the flat in the early morning hours through an open window and proceeded to strangle Mr. Carman to death before sexually assaulting him. This time, however, there were clear signs that a burglary had taken place, with the flat appearing to have been ransacked and between 400 to 500 pounds that Mr. Carman had hidden in the flat was missing. Detectives suspected that robbery had now become a secondary motive and the strangler was acting out his sexual urges on London's elderly residents. Indeed, it appeared that the killer had a unique sexual quirk and suffered from a form of gerontophilia, meaning he could only achieve a sexual gratification from having sex with the elderly. Just 4 days after Mr. Carman was found, another elderly victim was discovered, this time back over the south side of the Thames. On July 12th, 75-year-old widower Trevor Thomas was found dead in his bathtub at his home in Barton Court, Jeffreys Road in Clapham. He apparently had been dead for some time, possibly as many as a number of weeks. As a result, there was significant decomposition of his body, meaning much of the forensic evidence found was no longer usable. Although his death was not initially included among the victims of the Stockwell Strangler because it was impossible to determine how he died or if he had been sexually assaulted, his death was considered by detectives to be linked, and they were 90% certain that they were dealing with a 6th strangler victim. The strangler claimed another victim just 8 days later, when the body of 74-year-old William Downs was found at his home in the Overton estate, the same housing estate where the second victim, Janet Crockett, had been murdered. It appeared that the killer was returning to his favorite hunting grounds. Mr. Downs was a reclusive pensioner who lived alone and rarely left his small studio flat located on a block known as Holly's House, which was another low-rise block of flats that the killer seemed to favor. On the morning of July 21st, the body of Mr. Downs was found by his son in his bedroom, and it was determined that he had been murdered the previous evening. He was lying naked in bed with the sheets pulled up to his neck, in that familiar way the strangler left his victims. There were semen stains on the bed sheets and he had been strangled and sexually assaulted. The autopsy concluded that Mr. Downs died from asphyxia due to manual strangulation, and it appeared that the killer had once again gained entry through an unsecured window, but this time left a single palm print on the garden wall and gate as he entered the property. Downs' son later said that he would often warn his elderly father about the dangers of leaving his window unsecured, especially with a killer on the loose. He said, "I told him. I warned him to keep his door and windows locked, especially at night, but it was hot and I think he left one just slightly open to let some air in." The police had sufficient eyewitness descriptions of the killer, from surviving victim Fred Prentice to the staff members of the Somerville Hastings house. These descriptions were of a young-looking white male with a suntan face, short dark hair who had a deranged and frightening grin. There were several theories about the strangler in his day-to-day life. Some detectives surmised he might possibly work in an old people's home, or some type of employment such as a milkman or a postman that would put him in contact with his potential targets. There was also sufficient evidence to suggest that the killer was an experienced burglar who was skilled at gaining access to homes. The point was debatable, however, as the killer had left several prints at a number of crime scenes which seemed to indicate a carelessness for forensic awareness or an ineptitude of covering his tracks. There was no doubt that the killer was mentally unstable and sexually disturbed because of his paraphilia, with many suspecting he was a gerontophile. The person they sought was an extremely dangerous individual, and the police needed to stop his murderous spree. In 1986, fingerprint records were still in the transitional phase of being computerized from those held as physical copies, and despite hundreds of thousands of fingerprint records having already been transferred to computers, the work of transferring the palm prints had not yet begun. This meant the prints taken by detectives from the two crime scenes had to be checked manually against records held on file. The relatively small team undertaking this massive task had no less than 4 million files to check through. Through sheer perseverance, they were able to narrow down the number to a manageable amount by focusing on known South London petty criminals and burglars to create a match. The team was under immense pressure because investigators didn't know when the killer would strike again. He did just that on July 24th, 1986, when the Strangler claimed what would be his final victim. Like many of the elderly who were killed by the Stockwell Strangler, 80-year-old Florence Tisdall lived alone in her ground floor flat in an apartment block in Hurlingham. It was situated close to the River Thames and Putney Bridge, which had been her home for the past 60 years. Florence was partly deaf and blind, and she found it difficult to move without the use of a walking cane. She also had a love of cats, enjoying their company, and besides the 3 she owned, she also entertained and fed various neighborhood strays who wandered into her home. She regularly left a window open for them to come and go as they pleased. That morning, the body of Florence Tisdall was found by the apartment block caretaker Terry Bristow, who often checked on her. She was found lying in bed, the covers pulled up to her chin to hide the savage murder and sex attack which had taken place. The pathologist found that she had the signature bruising on her throat and 2 broken ribs from when the killer had knelt on her chest while strangling her. This latest murder of a defenseless old woman shocked the public and the police once more. The Metropolitan Police came under immense criticism for their failure to capture the Strangler. However, in the next few days, there would be a significant breakthrough. The team of detectives who had been searching through thousands of prints in an effort to match the palm print to a suspect had found a match. They finally had their suspect, and the public would soon have a name and a face to the monstrous Stockwell Strangler. The prints matched those of 24-year-old Kenneth Erskine, a known burglar and homeless drifter who was known to live a transient existence between several squats in the Stockwell and Brixton areas. Police staked out Erskine's last known address, one of the squats in Brixton, but it was discovered that he had left there some months ago, and investigators were unable to locate where he was currently living. When police made further inquiries, they found that Erskine regularly collected his unemployment benefits every Monday from a Social Security Department office in South London known as Keyworth House. He had been going there to claim since 1984 and was well known to the staff there, who called him the Whisperer because of his quiet and timid nature. On July 28, 1986, teams of officers staked out the building, and when Erskine arrived to sign on, he was placed under arrest. As he was handcuffed, Erskine offered no resistance or struggle. It was promptly taken to Clapham police station for questioning. The Stockwell Strangler was off the streets, and they now wanted to know what type of person could commit such heinous crimes against such vulnerable people. He told detectives that he didn't remember killing anyone, but may have done it without knowing it. A psychologist interviewed Erskine at great length and described how he lived in a world of his own and at times was unable to distinguish between fantasy and reality. He came to the conclusion that Ken had the mental age of an 11-year-old and was extremely impressionable and open to suggestion. That at times he would believe a story being read to him was about him personally. He would claim he wanted to be famous and exhibited confusing traits, such as nodding his head when he meant no, and shaking his head when he meant yes. The police posted 2 pictures of him to the media in an effort to gather more witnesses or leads. The release of these photographs resulted in dozens of calls, which mostly consisted of residents of Brixton who recognized Erskine because he was a familiar character around the area. But one call proved to be an extremely important sighting, which had occurred on the evening the Strangler killed his final victim. Investigators were contacted by Denise Keena, a 25-year-old businesswoman, who told them of an encounter she had with a man on Putney Bridge at around 11:30 on the evening of July 23rd. Denise recalled how she had been so terrified and disturbed by the behavior of this individual she saw on the street that she called the police, who arrived just after the man had vanished into the night. She gave them a chilling description. He had this sort of terrible grin on his face. He looked as if he was out of control. It was a horrible, awful, disgusting expression. He had wide, staring eyes and his mouth was open. All the muscles and tendons in his face were standing out. drawn tight against the bones. She said she recognized the man as Erskine when she first saw his photograph, and said the encounter took place just 200 yards from the first floor flat of Florence Tisdall, and would have occurred less than 30 minutes after she had been murdered by the Stockwell Strangler. When both Mr. Prentice and Miss Keena attended the police lineup, they both picked out Erskine as the man they had terrifying encounters with. Denise said he was the man she saw after the last murder acting strangely, and Mr. Prentice did not hesitate to identify him as the man who attempted to kill him. Kenneth Erskine was charged with the murders of Janet Crockett and William Downs, as well as the attempted murder of Frederick Prentice. While he was awaiting trial, more charges were added, including the murders of Nancy Ems, Valentine Gleim, Zbigniew Stabrava, William Carman, and Florence Tisdall. One death that was suspected but never linked was that of Trevor Thomas, because the forensic evidence was unusable for the Crown prosecution to file murder charges against Erskine. 3 other deaths were also linked to the Stockwell Strangler, those of Charles Querrell, Wilfred Parks, and John Jordan, all of whom were found dead in similar circumstances, but without sufficient evidence to prove Erskine's involvement. His trial began at the Old Bailey on January 12, 1988, and he was now charged with 7 counts of murder and 1 count of attempted murder. He pleaded not guilty to all the charges, but appeared quite indifferent to his surroundings, unaware of what was really going on around him. His disturbing behavior was now witnessed by the court, as he was scolded at least on one occasion for falling asleep. At one point, he was caught masturbating during the proceedings. The judge was told of the horrific crimes and how each of the elderly and frail victims had been brutally murdered and sexually assaulted, as well as the strange habits of the perpetrator, such as photographs at the scene being turned away or placed face down. The tapes also revealed Erskine admitting to robbing each of his victims' homes, but surprisingly claimed that some other person must have entered afterwards and committed each of the murders. The jury did not accept this story, and on January 29, 1988, they returned a unanimous verdict of guilty on all counts. As he stood before Mr. Justice Rose, Kenneth Erskine was sentenced to life imprisonment for each charge. The judge told him, "I have no doubt that the horrific nature and number of your crimes requires that I recommend a minimum sentence that you must serve. In all charges except the attempted murder, I recommend to the Secretary of State that you serve a minimum of 40 years. I waste no further words in cataloging the chilling horror of what you did. It is clear from the medical records that from a very young age, you treated others sadistically, and that your behavior sexually and in other ways was grossly abnormal. At the time, it was the longest sentence ever handed down by a judge in the English court." Erskine appeared close to tears when he heard the sentence, but regained his composure and was taken away by the bailiffs. Once imprisoned, Erskine accepted his fate and reportedly told a prison officer, "I'm nice and cozy inside, and I don't give a damn if I ever get out." Detectives had long suspected Erskine was possibly responsible for more murders than initially thought, but the issue was difficult to resolve, not least because Erskine himself was almost impossible to question, and officers never secured a coherent confession out of him. Erskine would stay largely out of the headlines, only coming to the attention of the British press a handful of times. During an incident in 1996, Erskine reportedly saved the life of Peter Sutcliffe when he raised the alarm when Sutcliffe was being attacked by another inmate, Paul Wilson, who almost strangled him to death with a pair of stereo headphones. He did not come under scrutiny again until 2005, when it was reported by the British tabloids that he was being prepared for a move to a medium security facility. His case was reviewed by a mental health tribunal who believed he was no longer a danger to the public. What? In a move that would cause considerable criticism, it was reported that Erskine was being recommended for a transfer to Lambeth Hospital, which was located in Stockwell, yes, the same community where he murdered 7 people. This decision generated particular fury from the British public, with one Broadmoor source quoted as saying, "Medical staff and psychiatrists now believe he is a low risk. If he is allowed to go back home, it will be an insult to all those old people he killed. The public may accept him being moved into a low security unit, but putting him in South London is a step too far." Erskine's lawyers made a fresh appeal against his murder convictions in July 2009 at the Court of Appeal in London. Erskine's QC, Mr. Edward Fitzgerald, told the judges that Erskine had been suffering from a chronic incurable condition, which would require lifelong treatment, and that the basis on which Erskine would be subject to release would be when his detention is no longer necessary for the protection of the British public. A report had been given by psychiatrist Dr. Andrew Horn, dated March 17, 2006, which contained an assessment of Erskine from September 2004. Horn, who had been a consultant at Broadmoor Hospital and one of Erskine's doctors for over 20 years, presented new medical evidence in his report, which states that the clinical schizophrenia Erskine had been diagnosed with since 1980 would have diminished his responsibility for his actions to a massive degree. Wow. In a decision announced by the Lord Chief Justice, Lord Judge, and 2 other judges, Erskine's convictions were reduced to manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility. In giving his reasons for quashing the murder convictions, Lord Judge said, "This is a straightforward case. It is overwhelmingly clear that at the time that the appellant appeared at trial, there was unequivocal contemporaneous evidence that his mental responsibility for his actions at the time of the killing was substantially impaired. We are satisfied that the convictions for murder were unsafe." The judges imposed a hospital order in Erskine's case, with Lord Judge commenting that in the interest of public safety, the order was handed down for an indefinite period. Erskine was promptly returned to Broadmoor Hospital, where he had served most of his sentence already. His risk status was downgraded in 2016, and he was moved to a medium secure hospital unit in Thornford Park Hospital in Thatcham, Berkshire. On April 23, 2023, he was approved for day release. You're telling me someone who kills 7 people, like literally breaking into people's homes, strangling them and robbing them, right? Killing, just, you're targeting older people. Maybe you do have a sexual fetish towards older people. Maybe you're doing it because you feel like these victims are really vulnerable and you can easily control them. Maybe you're doing it for shock value. Like, oh, why are you, what? He killed this innocent old lady. Wow, that's crazy. I don't get the British system. I don't get it. It should be 40 years for each murder conviction that adds together. So you're getting 280 years in prison. That would make sense. Not, oh, he serves 40 years. All these counts are concurrent. So they all run together, no matter how long. Like, it doesn't even make sense. Like, how are you going to kill 7 people and possibly even more and get out on parole? Like, what? This is a clear-cut case of a guy who's a psychopath, who clearly has like a sexual deviancy, who is clearly mentally handicapped and mentally disabled, who obviously will not be able to be controlled. So you're going to put him out in the free population again? I don't understand it. And the thing is, like, it can't be overcrowding. It's just that you really feel like these dudes can be rehabilitated. When you have like a sexual fetish like that, you can't be rehabilitated. You can't. That is something that's going to stick with you for the rest of your life. Oh, like, we can rehabilitate a pedophile. No, you can't. When somebody makes like their fetish like sexual, they're not going to break that because it's wired into their brain. You're never going to break that. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this. Leave a like, hit that subscribe button. Thank you so much for the support of my channel. I'm out. Peace.